The man stepped into the first-class cabin, wearing a plain charcoal jacket, carrying a worn travel bag that had seen better days. His shoes were scuffed at the toes. His watch was ordinary. There was nothing about his appearance that announced wealth or status, nothing that signaled to the world he was anything other than a passenger who had, by some stroke of luck or accumulated miles, found himself seated in the front of the plane. The other passengers barely glanced up. Flight attendants moved through the aisle with that practiced, efficient grace that belongs to people who have worked 1,000 departures. But one family noticed him immediately. They noticed him the way people notice something that doesn't fit the picture they already have in their minds. The father looked, then the mother looked, then their daughter looked, and something shifted in the air of that cabin, subtle and sharp at the same time, the way a temperature drops before a storm. The father let out a short laugh, quiet, meant for his wife but loud enough to carry. The mother pressed her lips together and gave the smallest shake of her head, the kind of gesture that says everything without saying a word. The daughter leaned in close and whispered what she was certain was the most logical explanation available to her. The man had surely sat down in the wrong seat. Nobody said anything directly to him. Not yet, but the judgment had already been rendered, swiftly and completely, before the boarding door had even closed. And then, when no one was expecting it, when the man himself had already settled in and opened his bag and pulled out a worn leather folder, the cockpit door opened. The captain stepped out. He was a tall man in his 40s, dressed in full uniform, with silver threading at his temples and the kind of steady, unhurried walk that belongs to someone who has guided aircraft through the worst turbulence the sky has to offer. He moved through the first-class cabin with purpose. He was not checking on passengers. He was not reviewing something with the crew. He walked directly to the man in the charcoal jacket, and his face broke into a wide, genuine smile. He extended his hand. And then he said the words that stopped the cabin cold. "Good afternoon, sir. It is truly an honor to have you on board with us today." The international terminal had been loud. That afternoon, the particular kind of loud that only major airports achieve. A layered symphony of rolling luggage and gate announcements, and the low murmur of thousands of conversations happening all at once. Marcus Johnson had moved through it all the way he moved through most things. Quietly, without drawing attention to himself, at his own pace. He was 51 years old, a broad-shouldered man, with close-cropped gray at his temples and deep-set eyes that had the quality of always being slightly ahead of whatever was happening around him. Observing, absorbing, processing, but rarely reacting. He carried a single travel bag over one shoulder, the kind that had been good quality once and had since achieved the comfortable shabbiness of something well used and never replaced out of vanity. His jacket was simple dark charcoal. His trousers were clean but unremarkable. He wore no visible jewelry. His shoes were the shoes of a man who wore shoes because shoes were necessary, not because shoes were a statement. A ground crew supervisor named Carol had spotted him near the priority boarding lane and greeted him by name, her voice warm, her posture subtly deferential in that way. People carry themselves around individuals they genuinely respect. Marcus had thanked her with the same unhurried kindness he extended to everyone. A brief, genuine smile, a soft word, nothing performative about it. He did not wave her off. He did not play at humility. He simply thanked her the way one human being thanks another for a small kindness. And then he moved on toward the gate. 2 ground operations staff further down the concourse had also looked up when he passed, and one of them had nodded with the brief, knowing nod of someone who recognizes a face from a magazine cover or a business profile. But Marcus had not acknowledged this, and had not slowed his pace. He moved through the terminal, the way water moves through a landscape, finding the path of least resistance, taking up exactly as much space as needed, and not 1 inch more. The Walker family was already in the boarding lane when he arrived. Richard Walker was 54 years old, and built like a man who had spent his 20s in a gym and his 40s forgetting about it. He wore a sport coat with a subtle plaid pattern that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he wore it the way expensive things look when the person wearing them needs others to know they are expensive. His wife, Victoria, was immaculately presented silk blouse, tailored slacks, hair arranged with the kind of precision that requires professional assistance. Their daughter, Emily, was in her mid-20s, sharp-eyed and pretty, with the restless energy of someone perpetually navigating social hierarchies. The Walkers were talking loudly about things wealthy people sometimes talk about when they want the people around them to understand that they are wealthy. A property deal Richard had recently closed, the renovation of their second home, an upcoming trip to a private island. The conversation had the curated quality of a performance, the words chosen not for the private pleasure of sharing them, but for the public pleasure of being overheard. Richard laughed a little too loudly at his own jokes. Victoria managed the social theater with the practiced ease of a woman who had been performing it for 27 years. Emily participated, but with slightly less conviction than usual. The way a person participates in a performance when they are beginning to wonder, privately, whether the performance is necessary. Marcus stood a few feet away, waiting, and he said nothing. He simply waited. When they boarded and settled into the first-class cabin, Richard Walker noticed immediately that the man in the charcoal jacket had taken the seat beside theirs. He looked at the man for a moment, then looked away, then looked back with the faint squint of someone running a calculation they are fairly certain they already know the answer to. The seat was legitimate. There was no question about that. No boarding error, no mix-up. And yet Richard found himself unable to fully accept what he was seeing. The man simply did not match his mental image of a first-class passenger. The bag was wrong. The jacket was wrong. The shoes were wrong. Everything was wrong. And Richard Walker was the kind of man who trusted his own assessments, the way other people trust gravity. He leaned slightly toward Victoria and made a sound that was not quite a word more of a low, amused exhale, and Victoria, without even looking up from her phone, understood perfectly. Emily glanced at Marcus, then at her parents, then at Marcus again, and then she flagged down a passing flight attendant with the bright, practiced smile of someone who has spent a lifetime expecting to be accommodated. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice light and pleasant. "Are you sure the gentleman over there is in the correct seat? I just want to make sure there hasn't been a mix-up." The flight attendant checked, confirmed that everything was in order, smiled politely, and moved on. Emily settled back. Her father shrugged with one shoulder, the shrug of a man who has not actually been proven wrong so much as momentarily inconvenienced. He straightened his jacket and picked up the menu and held it the way a man holds a prop when he wants to look like he is not thinking about something that is actually consuming his full attention. The remark started even before the cabin door closed. They were not aimed at Marcus directly. They never are, in situations like these. They were aimed at the space between people designed to land close enough to be heard, far enough to be denied. Richard Walker started it, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man who had been the loudest person in every room he had ever entered. "You know what they say," he remarked to Victoria, folding his jacket over his arm with deliberate elegance. "These days, anyone can buy the appearance of luxury." He said it with a smile, as though he were making a general philosophical observation, as though there were no specific target for the observation, as though he were simply a thoughtful man musing aloud about the nature of modern commerce. Victoria tilted her head and responded with the practiced weariness of someone who has been agreeing with her husband for decades. "Or perhaps," she said, "someone has been very diligently collecting their frequent flyer miles." She said it without looking at Marcus. She did not need to look at him. The remark was placed precisely. Emily, for her part, kept her voice at a murmur, ostensibly speaking only to her mother, but with the projection of a stage actress hitting the back row. "Maybe it's his very first time up front," she said, with a little smile that managed to be simultaneously sweet and devastating. "That would be sort of touching, wouldn't it?" And Richard added, a moment later, with the satisfaction of a man who has just successfully landed a punch. "Sometimes life just drops someone in the deep end, and they haven't quite figured out the dress code." The three of them shared a brief conspiratorial amusement that was over before it started, the way quick cruelties always are light on the surface, heavy in the air. Marcus heard all of it. There was nothing wrong with his hearing and nothing ambiguous about what was being said. The words landed exactly as they were intended to land, which was to say, they landed the way a small stone lands in still water not with great force, but with a ripple that extends outward in every direction. He did not react. He did not look up. He did not adjust his posture, or clear his throat, or do any of the small things that people do when they want to signal that they have heard something and have chosen to take offense at it. He simply continued doing what he had been doing before the remarks began, which was removing a slim leather folder from his bag and opening it across his tray table. He turned a page. He made a small notation in the margin. He was, by all visible appearances, entirely unbothered, and this, somehow, bothered the Walker family far more than any response could have. Richard watched him for a moment from the corner of his eye. The man's complete absence of reaction was almost an insult in itself. Richard was accustomed to the world responding to him. He was accustomed to his words carrying weight, to his presence filling space, to other people adjusting their behavior in acknowledgement of who he was and what he represented. This man with the worn bag and the ordinary shoes was simply reading, and the indifference was, in its own quiet way, a kind of dignity that Richard Walker had never learned to sit with. Richard decided he would start a conversation. Not to make peace. He was not in the business of making peace with people who hadn't actually challenged him, but to probe, to establish the hierarchy more firmly, to make the man explain himself, which would simultaneously make clear that he was the kind of man who needed to explain himself. Richard leaned over with a genial expression and introduced himself, leading with the name of his company before his own name, as was his habit. He had learned long ago that the name of the company landed before the name of the person, and that this sequencing communicated something important about the order of things. He waited for the recognition that usually followed. Marcus looked up from his folder, and his expression was pleasant and entirely neutral. He said his own name. In return, just his name, first and last, without title or context or embellishment. He shook the hand that was offered to him. He answered the questions that followed. Yes, he was headed to the same destination. Yes, the weather there this time of year could be unpredictable. Yes, he had made this particular flight before, but he offered nothing extra. No elaboration. No name-dropping. No counter-performance of status. When Richard told him about the company deal he had just closed, Marcus nodded and said, "Congratulations," and then returned to his folder. And somehow the two-word response managed to close the subject more definitively than a long reply ever could have. Richard leaned back in his seat. He told himself what he needed to tell himself, which was the simplest available explanation. The man was nobody in particular, a mid-level manager of some kind, or perhaps a consultant, someone who had earned an upgrade through accumulated business travel, but had not earned anything more significant than that. Called it, he muttered to Victoria, and Victoria nodded without looking up. The first strange thing happened about 20 minutes before boarding was complete. The lead flight attendant, a composed, silver-haired woman named Patricia, who wore her authority as quietly as her uniform, came through the cabin doing her final checks. When she reached the row where Marcus was seated, something shifted in her bearing. She addressed him by his last name, a small formality that nonetheless communicated a great deal, and she asked whether everything was to his satisfaction, in a tone that went slightly beyond the standard courtesy extended to first-class passengers. It was the tone of someone who had been specifically briefed. The Walker family noticed. Victoria looked up from her phone. Emily leaned forward a fraction of an inch. Richard's eyes narrowed. Patricia moved on before any of them could process what they had just witnessed. Continuing down the aisle with the same smooth efficiency as before, but the interaction lingered. A few minutes later, a junior flight attendant appeared at Marcus's seat with a glass of water, not the standard pre-departure sparkling water offered to all first-class passengers, but a specific still water in a specific glass placed on his tray table with a quiet, as requested by the airline, "Mr. Johnson." Marcus thanked the young woman with genuine warmth, asked her name, and thanked her again using it. She smiled a real smile, not the professional approximation, and moved on. The Walkers began speculating in low voices, which was essentially the same thing as speculating in full voice, because they had never really learned to whisper. A politician, Richard suggested, though the man didn't have the practiced visibility of a politician. A celebrity athlete was proposed and dismissed he was too old, or at least too unrecognizable, and athletes of any real note tended to travel with an entourage. Emily suggested a lawyer, which Victoria dismissed, and then Victoria suggested a real estate developer, which Richard dismissed. And then they arrived back where they started, which was a kind of frustrated uncertainty that Richard found deeply uncomfortable. If he were actually somebody, Richard said, with the finality of a man who had decided this argument, he would dress the part. This logic, to Richard, was airtight. The world he had built for himself ran on visible signals: the right neighborhood, the right car, the right watch, the right table at the right restaurant. Success announced itself. Power dressed accordingly. A man who looked the way this man looked was simply not what Richard needed him to be, and Richard Walker had spent enough of his life curating his own image to believe, sincerely and completely, that everyone who mattered did the same. He settled back against his seat with the expression of a man who has successfully resolved a minor puzzle, and he did not think about it again, at least not for the next several minutes. Then the flight attendant near the galley made a quiet call on the internal phone, glancing once toward the first-class cabin before turning away, and something in the gesture had a quality that Richard did not quite like, though he could not have explained why. Then the plane leveled out somewhere above 35,000 feet, and Marcus opened his laptop. Emily Walker was not a snoop by nature. She was, however, acutely observant, and the screen of a laptop opened in a seat adjacent to hers was not exactly private. She was not trying to read what was on it. She told herself that later. But the numbers were large. The kind of large that catches the eye even from a distance, even at an angle, the way a bright light catches the eye in a dim room. She saw column headers and financial summaries and figures that ran to 10 digits, and she saw email subject lines that referenced quarterly reports and acquisition timelines and board meetings. And she saw a name in one of the email headers that she recognized: not a friend, not a personal acquaintance, but a name she had heard her father say, with a particular reverence that he reserved for people he considered genuinely out of his league. She looked away. She looked back. She picked up her phone and opened a browser and typed a name, and then she closed the browser before the results fully loaded. And then she set her phone face down on her tray table and stared at the seat back in front of her with an expression her mother had never seen on her before, which was the expression of someone who has just seen the first edge of something very large and is trying to understand how large it is. She breathed carefully. She looked at the back of Marcus's head, the close-cropped gray, the set of the shoulders, the absolute stillness, and she tried to reconcile what she thought she had just seen with the story she had been telling herself since boarding. Richard noticed his daughter's silence. He was attuned to the social frequencies of his family, the way a conductor is attuned to the orchestra. He knew when something was off. He nudged her. She shook her head slightly and said nothing. He followed her gaze to the man with the laptop, and his own eyes traced the screen without being able to read it clearly from his angle. And he felt the first, faint tremor of something he was not yet ready to name. He told himself the numbers could be anything: projections from a consulting firm, a presentation someone had forwarded, something downloaded for professional development purposes. The simplest explanation was always the most likely. He repeated this to himself, and found, for the first time in a long while, that it did not fully work. The confidence that usually closed these internal debates had developed. Somewhere in the last few minutes, a small and inconvenient crack. Marcus closed the laptop when he was done with what he needed to do. He accepted a glass of juice from the flight attendant. He looked out the window at the clouds below, which were the soft gray-white of a wool blanket, and he seemed for a moment to be simply a man looking out a window and thinking about nothing in particular, which, perhaps, he was. He had the quality, which is rare in people of significant power, of being genuinely still, not the brittle stillness of someone suppressing a reaction, but the deep stillness of someone who had long since made peace with his own place in the world, and therefore had nothing to prove, nothing to perform, and nothing to defend. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small photograph, looked at it briefly, smiled to himself with the private quality of a smile that belongs to a memory rather than a moment, and then placed it carefully back inside the bag's inner pocket. The Walker family, who had been watching him without meaning to, looked away all at once, like birds startled from a wire. The cockpit door opened 17 minutes before landing. Captain Daniel Morris was a 22-year veteran of commercial aviation, a man who had logged more flight hours than most pilots accumulate in a career and a half, and who carried his experience the same way Marcus Johnson carried his quietly, without decoration. He came through the cockpit door with the unhurried ease of someone who has a specific purpose and no need to announce it. He did not stop at the galley. He did not speak to the crew. He moved through the first-class cabin with his gaze fixed forward, and then he slowed, and then he stopped, and then he turned. And the smile that crossed his face was the kind that a person cannot manufacture, the kind that is already fully formed before the muscles even start to move, because it comes from somewhere deeper than expression. He extended his hand to Marcus Johnson, who had looked up from his folder at the sound of footsteps, and he said, clearly, in a voice that carried through the entire first-class cabin without any apparent effort to make it do so, "It is good to see you, sir. It is genuinely an honor to have you on this flight today." The cabin did not go silent the way cabins go silent in movies, which is all at once, like a switch. It went silent the way a room full of people goes silent when they sense that something is happening that requires attention gradually and then completely. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Ice shifted in glasses. A child 3 rows back asked her mother a question, and the mother said, "Shh," in that automatic, distracted way of parents who are listening to something else. Marcus stood, and the two men shook hands with the easy warmth of people who have spoken before, who hold each other in genuine regard, who are glad to see each other in the particular way that goes beyond professional courtesy. The captain asked after Marcus's family, using a first name, a daughter's name, with the familiarity of someone who had heard about her before, perhaps more than once. Marcus asked after the captains, and they spoke for a moment. The way men speak when they have limited time, but genuine warmth for each other, and want to make use of both. Then the captain said something that none of the passengers who heard it would forget. He said, and his voice carried the weight of a man who means precisely what he is saying, "I want you to know that the program you funded, the one for first-generation aviation students, it changed the entire direction of my son's life. He starts training in September. I wouldn't have that without what you built." Marcus placed one hand briefly on the captain's shoulder and said something in a low voice that only the captain heard, and the captain nodded, and his jaw tightened slightly, the way jaws tighten when a man is holding something back, and then the captain returned to the cockpit, and the door closed behind him, and the first-class cabin existed in a silence so complete it had a physical texture. Victoria Walker was the first to move. She reached out and pressed her hand over her husband's arm, not to say anything, simply to make contact, the way people reach for something solid when the ground shifts. Richard sat very still. His jaw had a particular set to it, the set of a man who is doing rapid and uncomfortable recalculations. Emily had her phone out, and this time she did not close the browser. She typed the name she had seen on the screen, Marcus Johnson, and let the results load. And she read them, and the color in her face changed the way color changes in the sky when a weather system moves through. She scrolled, she read, she scrolled again. Around them, the other first-class passengers were beginning to register what had just happened. The low murmur of recognition spreading through the cabin like water finding the lowest points of a surface, moving from person to person, filling the space between seats with something that was not quite conversation and not quite silence. A man 3 rows back stood up. He was in his early 60s, built like someone who had once been an athlete and still carried the discipline in his posture, and he wore the particular brand of quiet confidence that tends to accompany significant success in finance. He looked at Marcus for a moment, and then he said, in a tone of genuine surprise rather than performance, "Are you Marcus Johnson? The Marcus Johnson?" There was something almost old-fashioned about the phrasing, the repetition of the name, the use of the, as though a man could become so definitively himself that his name alone required the definite article. Marcus looked at him with the mild, slightly resigned expression of someone who has spent most of his adult life hoping not to be recognized and having learned to accept that this hope is rarely fulfilled. He confirmed, quietly, that he was. And that confirmation, those two small words moved through the cabin the way a stone moves through water. The man 3 rows back sat back down heavily. The woman beside him said something in a low voice, and he whispered something in return. And both of them looked at Marcus with the particular expression of people who are revising a story they have been telling themselves. A woman in the aisle seat across from the walkers had already opened her own phone and was typing quickly. A silver-haired couple near the front of the cabin exchanged a long glance that contained, in its unspoken fullness, an entire conversation. The cabin had reorganized itself around a new gravity, and that gravity was sitting quietly in a charcoal jacket, reading a leather folder, entirely unconcerned with the reorientation happening around him. Because here is what it meant to be Marcus Johnson, at 51 years old, in a first-class cabin on an afternoon flight. It meant you had grown up in a 2-room apartment, in the kind of neighborhood that does not appear on anyone's real estate wish list, in a household where the electricity was sometimes optional, and the question of whether there would be dinner was sometimes genuinely open. It meant your mother had worked 2 jobs for most of your childhood, and your father had left before you were old enough to remember him clearly, and the public school you attended had textbooks that were older than your teachers. It meant you had built the first version of your company on a second-hand computer in a room you shared with 2 other people, and that the first time you tried to get a small business loan, the man behind the desk had looked at you with the expression of a person who has already made up his mind before the conversation begins. It meant you had been refused at hotel front desks and followed around retail stores and questioned at the doors of buildings you owned. It meant you had, over the course of 26 years, built a technology company that now employed thousands of people across multiple continents, and that your net worth was the kind of number that requires a moment of adjustment when you encounter it in print, and that the foundations you had established had funded educational programs in dozens of cities, and that your name was known to every serious business mind in the country, and yet here you sat in your charcoal jacket and your worn shoes and your travel bag exactly as you had always sat. Because Marcus Johnson had decided a very long time ago that he was not going to spend his life performing himself for an audience. He was going to simply be himself. And if other people needed more than that, then that was a problem that belonged to them. Emily Walker read all of this on her phone, and as she read, the afternoon's events reorganized themselves in her memory, with a horrible and clarifying precision, each comment, each glance, each casual cutting remark, and what had felt, at the time, like the natural exercise of social judgment, now revealed itself as something else entirely, not just wrong in the factual sense, wrong in a deeper way. Wrong in the way that things are wrong when they expose something in you that you would prefer not to see. She set her phone face down on her tray table again. She looked at her hands. She looked at her father. Richard was staring straight ahead, at nothing. He had the look of a man who has been handed a mirror when he was expecting a window and does not like what the mirror shows him. Victoria had set down her own phone and was very carefully and very deliberately not looking at anyone, which was, itself, a kind of looking. The 3 of them sat in the specific quality of silence that exists between people who know each other well enough to understand that nothing needs to be said aloud because all of it is already happening, interior and unavoidable. Victoria was the first to speak. She spoke quietly, pressing the words down so they did not carry beyond the row. "Richard," she said. He did not respond. "Richard," she said again, differently this time, with the urgency of a woman who has made a decision for both of them. He looked at her. She looked at the man in the charcoal jacket. And Richard Walker, who had built his entire adult identity on the belief that he was a man of discernment, a man who could read a room and read a person and understand immediately what he was dealing with. Richard Walker understood, in this moment, that he had been none of those things today. He had been something much smaller, something that, if he were being honest with himself, he had perhaps been many times before, in many rooms, with many people he had never bothered to actually see. He stood. His legs felt oddly uncertain, as though the floor of the cabin had developed a slight instability that was not there before. He moved the 2 steps to Marcus's row and stood there, and Marcus looked up from his folder with the same neutral, unhurried expression he had worn since boarding, and waited. Richard opened his mouth, and what came out first was not a sentence, but a kind of long exhalation, the sound of a man releasing something he had been carrying without knowing it. Then the words came. He said that he owed an apology. He said it plainly, without adornment, without the elaborate self-justification that men like Richard usually bring to moments of accountability. He said he had looked at Marcus and drawn conclusions from what he saw, and that those conclusions had been wrong, and that the way he had spoken the things he had said, the tone in which he had said them had been disrespectful. He said he was sorry. He said it like he meant it. Victoria, who had followed her husband to his feet without quite deciding to, added her own apology, in a voice that was quieter than Richard's, and carried a different quality, something more personal, more genuinely shaken, the voice of a woman who was not just sorry for what she had done today, but for the habit of it, the long, casual, unexamined habit. Emily stayed in her seat. She looked at her hands again. Later, when she had more time to think about it, she would realize that her silence was itself a kind of statement that she had not yet found the words and was not willing to offer empty ones. Marcus listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not wave it away or rush to reassure or say anything that would allow the walkers to move past the moment before they had fully sat with it. When Richard finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone who is choosing words carefully, not because he is angry, but because he wants to be accurate. Then he spoke, and his voice was calm, and it had in it the particular quality of something said many times before, not rehearsed, but settled, long processed. He told them that this was not the first time something like this had happened to him, not the 10th time, not the 100th time. He told them about the hotel in Chicago where the front desk had called security when he asked to check in, because the man behind the desk could not believe that the reservation in the system corresponded to the man standing in front of him. He told them about the luxury car dealership where he had been followed from the moment he walked through the door by a salesman whose helpfulness had the quality of surveillance. He told them about the investment meeting where the other men in the room had directed their questions to his younger, white business partner, as though Marcus were present in some administrative capacity, as though the company that bore his name were not actually his. He told them about the countless ordinary moments, the airports, the restaurants, the hotel lobbies, the sidewalks in which he had felt the particular weight of being seen as something less, something threatening, something out of place, something that needed to justify its presence. He did not say any of this with bitterness. He said it the way you tell a true story, evenly, precisely, without editorializing, letting the facts carry the weight. And then he told them about the people who had helped him along the way, the ones who had not looked at the surface and stopped there. The professor at the community college who had pushed him into a computer science course he thought was beyond him, the small business owner who had given him a part-time job and then quietly, over many months, taught him how contracts worked and what leverage meant, and how to sit across a table from someone who did not believe in you and hold your ground. He told them about the first woman who had ever worked for him, a receptionist who had answered phones in the tiny office he had rented in a rundown building, and who had quit a better-paying job to do it because she believed in what he was building before there was any logical reason to. He spoke about her with a particular tenderness, the tenderness of a man who carries certain debts as honors rather than obligations. Then he said something that the walkers would carry with them for a long time afterward, and that several of the other passengers who were listening, who had all, by this point, stopped pretending not to listen, would also carry with them. He said, "I learned something very early, and I had to keep learning it, because it's the kind of thing that sounds simple but isn't. Anger is a reasonable response to being treated badly. It is a human response. But anger alone doesn't change the person who has treated you badly. It doesn't change the system that made them think it was acceptable. It doesn't change the room you're standing in. The only thing that changes rooms, over time, is presence. Showing up. Staying. Building something that lasts long enough that the next person who walks in, whoever they are, wherever they come from, walks into a room that's a little more open than the one you found." He paused. He looked at Richard with an expression that was not forgiveness. Exactly. Forgiveness is a thing given to someone who has asked for it and earned it over time, but was something like openness, an open door, the possibility of a different kind of encounter than the one they'd started with. He looked at Victoria and then briefly at Emily, who had turned in her seat to face him for the first time since he had boarded, and his expression did not change. Same openness, same steadiness, offered equally, without conditions. The cabin was very quiet. Somewhere in the back, a child was playing a game on a device with the volume turned low. Outside the windows, the altitude had thinned the clouds, and the late afternoon light was doing something extraordinary, spreading gold across the tops of the cumulus formations below, as though the sky itself were slowly catching fire. Richard Walker sat back down. He did not say anything more. And this restraint, this willingness to let the silence be what it was perhaps the most honest thing he had offered in the entire exchange. A man in his 50s, from a position of comfort and certainty, being asked to simply hold still and feel the weight of something true, and actually doing it. It was not nothing. Emily typed the name of one of Marcus's foundations into her browser and read about it for several minutes without speaking. The foundation funded technology education programs in underserved communities, scholarships, equipment grants, mentorship pipelines, after-school labs in neighborhoods that did not otherwise have them. She read a quote from a program graduate, a young woman who had grown up 6 blocks from where Marcus had grown up, who was now leading an engineering team at a company building tools for climate research. She read about the program's expansion into 43 cities. She set her phone down again, but this time, she did not set it face down. She left its screen up on her tray table, and the foundation's name was visible, and she left it there deliberately, as though the visibility of it were a small and necessary thing. The captain's voice came through the speakers with the particular gentle authority of a man who has announced 1,000 landings. He gave the standard information about the approach to the local time, the weather, the gate number, and then he paused, briefly, before signing off, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to note that we have had a very special passenger with us on this flight today. A man whose work in technology and education has touched more lives than most of us will ever know. On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for flying with us, Mr. Johnson." There was a brief, surprised silence in the cabin, and then the applause began. Not the polite, obligatory applause of an audience fulfilling a social contract, but the genuine kind, the kind that starts from somewhere real, that spreads from person to person, not because people feel they should, but because something in the moment calls for it. Marcus looked out the window with an expression that was part embarrassment and part something warmer, and he raised one hand briefly in acknowledgement, and then he looked back at his folder and made a small notation in the margin, the same way he had been making notations since the flight began, as though the world's recognition were a pleasant weather event that he could appreciate and then continue working through. The plane touched down with the practiced smoothness that belongs to 22 years of experience, and the familiar sounds of landing filled the cabin. The reverse thrust, the gradual slowing, the shift of weight as the aircraft found the ground and committed to it. People began gathering their things. The Walker family moved slowly, without their earlier efficiency. Richard stood and reached into the overhead bin and was surprised to find Marcus beside him, also reaching for his bag, the worn travel bag that had started this whole sequence of events. They stood for a moment, 2 men, at the overhead bin, which is as prosaic a human situation as exists, and Richard looked at him. Not the calculating look from before, just a look. "I appreciate what you said," Richard told him. "I mean that." Marcus nodded. "Good," he said. Not "no problem," not "don't worry about it," just "good." As though he meant it too. As though it mattered that Richard had heard. As though the possibility of change was something worth acknowledging without either overstating or dismissing. Richard looked at him for one more moment. The charcoal jacket, the worn bag, the ordinary shoes. At the gate, as passengers filed through the jetway, Emily Walker paused and turned back. And for a moment, she and Marcus made eye contact, and she said something that cost her a visible effort to say, which was that she was sorry, specifically for what she had said about the seat. Marcus looked at her the way he had looked at her father, with that quality of openness, that absence of contempt. "It's okay," he said, which was a different thing from, You're forgiven, but was also, in its own way, a gift. She nodded once and moved on. Marcus walked through the terminal at the same unhurried pace he always walked. Around him, the airport was doing what airports always do: moving, rushing, announcing, departing. He passed the same banks of shops and the same carpeted corridors and the same large windows overlooking the tarmac where aircraft sat, waiting in the late afternoon light. He stopped at a water fountain and took a long drink and straightened up and adjusted the strap of his travel bag on his shoulder. His jacket was still charcoal and still unremarkable. His shoes still carried the honest wear of miles, traveled without vanity. He looked, as he always looked, like a man who had somewhere to be and every confidence that he would get there. A young man near the newsstand glanced up at him. Not a long look, not a significant look, just the brief glance of one person registering another, and then looked back down at his phone. And Marcus Johnson moved through the terminal, the way he had always moved through everything, forward and without apology, and without the need for the world to understand the distance he had traveled in order to arrive at this particular moment in this particular place. There is a kind of arrogance that wears expensive clothes and fills rooms with its own noise, and there is a kind of strength that wears whatever it wants and needs no room at all. Richard Walker had spent 54 years confusing the first for the second. He would spend a long time, afterward, learning the difference, learning it slowly, the way adults learn things that should have been obvious, through the particular shame of having been certain when you were wrong. His wife would begin to notice, in the weeks that followed, that he was quieter in some rooms than he used to be. His daughter would later tell a friend that something had shifted in her father on a flight that spring, and she could not entirely explain it, but it had something to do with a man in an ordinary jacket who had said things in a calm voice at altitude, and had then gotten off the plane and walked away without looking back. The lesson had not come from a pulpit or a lecture or a curated moment of moral instruction. It had come from a window seat on an afternoon flight, from a man who simply sat where he had every right to sit, and did not move, and did not perform, and did not explain himself. And somehow that had been enough. Somehow, that had been, for the people sitting nearby, everything. The most powerful person in the room is not always the loudest, not always the best dressed, not always the most loudly accompanied, or the most visibly important, or the most willing to announce themselves. Sometimes it is the person who requires nothing from the room at all, the person whose sense of self is so complete, so grounded, so long since settled into its own foundation, that the opinions of strangers are simply weather. They arrive, they move through, they pass, and the person beneath them remains exactly what they have always been. Marcus Johnson had not boarded that plane to teach anyone a lesson. He had boarded it the way he boarded every plane because he had somewhere to be, and this was the most efficient way to get there. He had not arranged for the captain's greeting. He had not orchestrated the moment of recognition. He had not calculated the effect his silence would have on the family beside him, or managed the impression he made on the passengers behind him. He had simply been himself, completely and without apology, and the world had done what the world sometimes does around that quality of self-possession. It had organized itself accordingly. The lesson was not his to give. It had arrived on its own, the way important lessons usually do, not through instruction, but through encounter, not through someone standing up and declaring the moral of the story, but through a series of moments that assembled themselves, quietly and inevitably, into something that could not be unseen. And in the long corridor of the terminal, with the afternoon light turning amber through the tall windows and the world continuing its relentless, indifferent motion all around him, Marcus Johnson walked on, steady, unhurried, and entirely, completely himself. There is something worth sitting with in the story of that afternoon flight. Not the revelation, the unmasking, the moment the curtain pulled back, because that part is easy to focus on, easy to shape into a satisfying arc with a clear before and after. What is harder, and more honest, and more worth the attention is everything that happened before the curtain moved. Every moment in which Marcus Johnson simply continued to exist, calmly and without performance, in the presence of people who had decided he was less than he was. Every notation in the margin of his folder, every polite, unhurried answer to a question designed to diminish. Every second of silence that was not passivity, but something much harder, a conscious, practiced, deeply earned choice not to give his energy to people who had not earned it. That is not a small thing. Most people, in that situation, would have reacted. Most people carry within them a well-worn mechanism for responding to disrespect: the sharp look, the clipped word, the decision to make the other person feel, even briefly, the weight of what they have done. And that mechanism is not wrong. It is human. But Marcus had learned, through years and repetition and the particular education that comes from being underestimated in the same room over and over again, that the response that serves you most is often the one that does not come at all. Silence as strategy, stillness as power, presence, full and undeniable and impossible to dismiss, as the only reply that truly cannot be argued with. He had learned this not because he was incapable of anger, but because he was capable of something larger: the long view, the patient certainty that what he was building would outlast every moment of disrespect by decades. And he had been right. He was still being right. At 35,000 feet, making notations in the margin of a leather folder, while a family in expensive clothes quietly revised everything they thought they knew.